Yeah.
Then you're.
Okay, it is 6:30. So Joy in the room. We have Chris, John, Craig, myself, Ray, and
Brad.
Brad. Jeez. Brad.
Yeah.
Brad must be on the other side of you.
Brad is not on camera. Brad's over on the other side. Yes,
Okay.
he's sitting over with Ray.
Yeah.
And then I see Frank and Dan on Zoom, and Gina and Shelley.
Hi, everyone.
And there's Joe. Joe Wilson's on too.
On Zoom too. We got Joe on Zoom. All right. So that's everybody who's here. So this is a special, just to review, the agenda is pretty straightforward. We're gonna have a short presentation from Nan, and then we'll get into questions and answers and then have some discussion after. So it's a pretty simple agenda, I think, tonight. So I guess might as well just get started. So Nan, if you want.
Okay, let me share my screen. Is that up?
Yep.
Okay, good. Let me make this a little bigger. Okay, so yeah, so I just have a few slides, just to talking points to start us off. I don't want to take too long. It kind of I don't want to repeat history, but just to get everyone remembering what we've done to get to this point. It started with a tour that I did of the town and a meeting with the planning board where we discussed issues, and we did a little exercise talking about what you think are the strengths and the weaknesses and the issues that we need to be addressing, and talked about the logistics of the project, followed by a series of interviews with various stakeholders from staff, elected officials, and various committee members from different groups in town. I reviewed all of the documents, the plans, the studies that you've done, the laws in your code, the comprehensive plan, of course. And that gave me the background as I reviewed the zoning and subdivision and the manufactured or the mobile home law, to put it into context and say, well, we're not just reviewing these laws, but we're reviewing them in context of what the town has planned and hoped to accomplish. So we're looking for, the audit is really looking for consistency between your policies that you've adopted in your plans, consistency with state laws and procedures for zoning and site plan and subdivision. So that's basically, in summary, the process that we took to get to this point, and submitted the report to you. And so we're at the point now of, this is our first real opportunity to answer questions and discuss the components of it and where you want to go from here. So I was trying to think of how to characterize. There was a lot of detail in the report, and I apologize in advance if it was, I don't know on your part if it was hard to read and hard to kind of digest it all. But I did want to be as thorough, even though some of the points were small. I wanted to give you as much information as possible. So if you look at kind of in the broad picture, you can kind of see that there were a couple themes that emerged both in the subdivision and the zoning. And that started with to update the policy statements of both the zoning and the subdivision law. I think those are extremely important and often overlooked sections of local laws. They lay out the policy of why you have zoning and why you have subdivision laws. And they need to reflect the values and the desires of the community. So as a broad theme, I think that those purpose sections in both the subdivision and the zoning could use some updating to really reflect the values and the direction that the comprehensive plan sets you in. The subdivision, I mean, it had components in there, but I think if there's any place to lay out what your performance expectations are, what you hope to accomplish, what kind of development you're really looking for, it's in those purpose statements. The second theme is the need to update definitions. There were missing definitions. I had a whole list of definitions that I felt could be added. There were some out-of-date definitions. So I think for both the subdivision and the zoning, there could be some work done. And kind of like the purpose statement or the policy statements or the purpose statements, I think definitions, you can never have too many definitions. I think they're super critical for the planning board. They're super critical for applicants and everyone. So everyone is on the same wavelength about what the terms that you're using mean. The next one is the looking at the review processes that you have, and that would be the actual, not the standards, but the process that you take, that the zoning and the subdivision law takes you through, and that those need to be consistent with New York State town law. And while there wasn't any real egregious, like, wow, this is really wrong kind of things, I think that my philosophy is that that right now your zoning and subdivision and your site plan refers to the process that the state law requires to do a site plan, for instance, or a special use permit. So that means that both the planning board as well as applicants have to look at the state law to know what that process is. And I just think it's a better practice to have those procedures all in one place and have them outlined in your zoning and your subdivision law. It does add length to the documents, but I think it also adds a lot of clarity so that it's very clear what the steps are that you have to take from your side, as well as what the applicants know, and know what is to come. And there's a lot of different ways to help applicants learn more about the review process, but in terms of application forms and flow charts and checklists and things like that I think you can have. But I still do think that the law itself should outlaw, not just refer to the state process, but to actually outline what that is. And then the fourth broad theme was what I felt was a need to do a better job of integrating the design guidelines that you currently have and that your laws currently refer to, but they're guidelines and they're not standards and they're really not performance expectations. They're good and they're a great place to start and they're mostly fine, but I think that they could be, they would address the design and the siting issues better if they were actually illustrated in part of the zoning law, not just referred to. And some of the sections of those guidelines are written, kind of permissively, like, well, we would encourage this and this is the better way of doing it. And so I get that there's a balance between, hard line, this is the way it has to be, and we want to build in enough flexibility for creativity. But I also think that based on what you're trying to accomplish from the comprehensive plan, that you could do a better job of integrating those into the actual laws. And many laws are illustrated, especially form-based codes. They are the illustrations. So we can talk about that again in a minute. So let's start first about the subdivision. So some of the things and this is just kind of a high level summary of what I, thought were some of the major points to talk about tonight. The audit recommendations for the subdivision law again, goes back to the enhancing the purpose statements and the definitions. That kind of stands for all of the local laws. And again, to have the design guidelines incorporated and to be made part of the development standards for subdivisions. I think that there could be some work done to enhance the conservation subdivision section, to expand on that and really give a thorough discussion of what really goes into how a conservation subdivision is designed. It's not just a cluster. There's a lot more to it. And I think, again, you get a better subdivision at the end when the expectations for what is open space, how do you choose what the open space is, how do the homes get cited to be advantageous for both the new residents and the environment and the community. All of that is part of a more comprehensive conservation subdivision design section. My recommendation is that at least in certain areas in the town, that the conservation subdivision be the required design method for major subdivisions. I have found over the years that putting in a conservation subdivision or even the older fashioned cluster design kind of sections in the zoning, if they're like, here it is, we'd like you to use it, you can use it if you want to, they don't get used. And I think that I think the conservation subdivision has a lot of traction for Dryden and would have, is a good method to promote the kind of development you want to address housing and growth, but do it in a way that respects the environment that clearly was a high value and desired to be protected in the comprehensive plan. So I usually recommend that they be mandatory, the mandatory design for major subdivisions, or that you leave it as a voluntary practice, but you incentivize it with various density bonuses. So the subdivision law, with some coordination with the zoning law, would articulate the things that the town is looking for, certain kinds of open spaces, it might be affordable housing, it might be use of renewable energy or EV chargers, lead energy standards. There's a whole list of things that you can incentivize through density bonuses. So you could look at, mandatory or bonuses. The thing about the bonuses is that the bonuses can't be token. They have to be real incentives, or else no one's going to take advantage of it. So it depends on whether you want to have an approach to incentivize the things you're looking for, or whether they're just so important you're going to require a conservation design. So it could be by in certain locations or under certain conditions, either on the site or size of the development. So there's all sorts of ways we can accomplish those things. The other thing that I recommended for the subdivision, again, with some coordination with the zoning, is I think that there needs to be an emphasis on the review and the citing of building envelopes. The building envelope is the area on a subdivision, on a plot or a plat that shows where the house is, where the driveway is, and where the, if you have a septic system, where that's going to be. If you don't really look at where the building envelope goes, you're just concentrating on the lines. And the lines really don't mean, the lines have legal status, obviously, but in terms of planning and meeting the goals of the community, the impact is of where the structures go, not where the lines are. So my philosophy is that the subdivision needs to pay more attention to the siting of things on the parcel, and that's becomes part of the subdivision review process. I think there could be some process improvements. I think a more articulated section that talks about escrow accounts and how they're used. And so I'm only going by what was written on the paper. I don't know what your practice is. I don't know how you collect or use escrows. So you may be doing a much more thorough job of collecting the escrow and using the escrow to help you with your review processes. I'm just going by what it said in the code. And I felt that that could be enhanced to give, make sure that you have the funding to be able to get the expertise that you might need for a certain project, so that the escrow covers those costs. So if you need a landscape architect, an attorney or an engineer or some other special expertise to help you review or offer input into some sort of subdivision, that's there for you. I think there could be some improved submission requirements, so that long list of things that are things that you ask for on a plat. I think that that we could expand that list to make sure it includes some of the environmental features that that you're clearly concerned about, that are mentioned in the comprehensive plan. I think also that I mentioned the update to the lot line adjustment process, which those are, those are the simple, usually simple, not always. Sometimes you have complicated ones, but those are something that that are often separated out in the subdivision law as a separate thing. So they're really not. Locally, you can call a lot line adjustment either a subdivision or a lot line adjustment. And I'm recommending that they be handled more administratively, if they meet certain, unless they are creating some sort of problem. And while I don't have it in this slide, I did in the full recommendations talk about the concern that I have. Again, these are on paper, that how the zoning is set up and how the minor subdivisions are administratively approved rather than going through the planning board. And I totally get why that is that way. I mean, the thought of a minor subdivision is it's minor and it's not really, having much impact on anything. And you do have a provision where if there's certain triggers that it goes back to the planning board. But my hang up with having the planning department approve minor subdivisions without the planning board involvement is, first of all, how I read the state authorizing legislation authorizes the planning board to do subdivisions, and it requires seeker. And it just seemed, I get from a process point of view that that's simple and you want to move those things through the system. But I've seen that system recommended or put into place only a few places. And I think that overall I'm not, saying that Ray and the building and the planning department isn't doing a good job on them. I just think it's more it's more of the job of the planning board than of staff to completely do. We could do there's like a hybrid where the staff goes through and gets everything ready and makes a recommendation, and the planning board then, does the approval. We can talk about how you want to do that, but that was a somewhat, that process was somewhat concerning to me, as I outlined in the audit report. So let's talk, and I know I'm going through these fast, but I want to make sure that there's plenty of time for you guys to chat and ask questions, and so I don't want to do all the talking. So I'm going through these a little fast. So in terms of the zoning, again, we have that first kind of, we really need to mesh our purpose statements and our policy statements with the comprehensive plan so that it's very clear, the values and the objectives that the town is trying to meet by having zoning. Lots of update to the definitions, that would be helpful. I think that you also need to update your zoning map. You've had several plan developments that have been approved that are not on the map, and those are zoning districts. So they should be, once they're created, they should be on the zoning map and kept that up to date. I had quite a few comments about the use table. And there's really two ways of looking at the use table. It's complicated in the sense that the terminology, like the acronyms that you use were, to designate a special use permit versus a site plan versus permitted or permitted with site plan. I just think the usability of the table could be improved. But I think there's also a lot of uses on there that are appropriate in some districts, like in some of the commercial districts. Then I'm not sure why you have so many special use permits for some of those, and I think that could be cleaned up. Certainly, site plan is really important for all of our commercial uses, I believe. But I'm not so sure that it's a special use permit is needed in the commercial areas for commercial use. However, out in the more rural parts of town, the special use is a more appropriate, because you're trying to mesh uses that may not mix as well. The other thing about the use table is that I had a list of items that I think there are, again, my reading of your comprehensive plan, it seems that there are quite a few uses that are commercial, industrial, light industrial types of uses in rural agriculture and residential districts that don't seem to match with if you read the zoning and the purpose statements for each district, and then you look at the use table, to me, it didn't seem like there was always a good match between the uses and what you were trying to accomplish in those districts. As I said before, I think that integrating the design guidelines and to translating them into development standards with illustrations is really important to get at design and siting. The design guidelines that BN did a number of years ago, they're excellent, but I think they could be, again, my perspective is if those are the designs you want, then they shouldn't be guidelines. They should be standards with enough flexibility to plan and be creative, but not to make it so, not to put it so. My perspective on all of these is that the town should be outlining what your performance expectations for development are, not dictated by applicants. So by changing the design guidelines into, these are our performance expectation, reasonable, not overdone, that I think it would get you further. And, there was the question that was raised about whether a form-based code would be appropriate in town. And, a form-based code is like a pure form-based code that pays more attention to design and siting is appropriate in some cases, but there's a lot of other things in zoning that are important. I'm not a lover of solid form-based code everywhere. I think hybrids work well. And there's you cross the line between whether they're just illustrated design standards or a form-based code. But I think that if you do go with a form-based code, you have opportunities for it, especially in Varna. And maybe if you decide to go with some of the other focused nodes, that they would be good in the more of the developed areas, but not necessarily out in the other zoning districts. And again, like subdivision, I really strongly recommend that your process be articulated and not just referred to the state laws, that you have the timeframes in the hearing, and the whole step by step is included in the code itself. The other thing that that you all, it might not be anything you agree with, but I think that to ask the town board to do special use permits is, especially when there's quite a bit of development like you have taking place, I think that's a lot. And that's kind of the old way of doing things. In the, I don't know when it was, in the 80s, early 90s, the state law changed to authorize either the town board or the planning board to review and issue special use permits. And I just think that the planning board is, I'm not saying the town board is not equipped, but I think the planning board does the planning. And it seems that it might be more of a streamlined process to have the planning board review and approve the special use permits than the town board. I know that's a big change from what you're used to. When I looked at how the regulations are written and all of the things that the town board is doing, I was like, wow, that's great, but I don't know how the town board has the ability to do all of that and with all of their other agenda items. So I just think that that's something for you to think about and move that over to the planning board. So we talked about some improvements that could make it a little more consistent with the comprehensive plan. I just mentioned moving some uses in some of the commercial districts from requiring a special use permit to a site plan review. We talked about this inconsistent with the district purposes. I think that if you look at the bulk or the dimension requirements that you have, that they're not bad. But I think that there are some things that you could reevaluate that would get you further along. I think looking at lot sizes, the density, you have a goal for more affordable housing, and that's great. But you also, higher density also could conflict with agriculture and could conflict sometimes with environmental protection that you want to do. So it can't be an across the board, we're going to have more density, but going along with your comprehensive plan, focused in density in the right places. And looking at lot coverage and lot frontages especially, I think are problematic in many rural areas, because by having a large lot frontage requirement, you're simply spreading out the residential development rather than planning for the best places for it. So I'm not a lover of large lot frontages. I think it simply uses up all the land in a community by having a frontage. And I think that if you want to focus in nodes and have walkable communities and walkable neighborhoods, and you have water and sewer in some places, that having big lot frontages really doesn't make a lot of sense. There was a lot of feedback that I got about the difficulty that people have with where to measure the front setback from, whether it should be from the edge of the right of way, the edge of the road, for the center line. And I recommended that I believe this was how your zoning used to be before this latest iteration. But I recommend that the center line is a more measurable location. Every road has a different right of way, depending on whether it's a county road, a town road, or a state highway. The edge of the road can change if another lane is added. So it's not as consistent really as the center line of the road. So that's what I recommended there. So some of the other improvements that I mentioned in here, and this again is just kind of high level. I'm sure there are others that you might picked up on that we could talk about. I think having a stream corridor overlay would be, so basically that is a setback from the stream where disturbances are, it's like a buffer. So we're minimizing disturbances to that really important, the riparian zone along either side of the stream is such an important part of the health of the stream, especially now with climate change and more flooding, more frequent flooding or more severe flooding. They are not good places to build. And so I think there's a lot of really good reasons to have a stream corridor overlay that sets a certain distance from the top of the bank to be not disturbed or minimally disturbed. As I mentioned before, I think you could expand the use of bonuses as incentives. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to kind of, you give something to get something. So if there's certain amenities, like I said, getting to renewable energy, energy conservation, open space, senior housing, affordable housing, recreation, all of those things can have some level of incentive added. So you get extra density, more units, if you offer these other features to the town. So I think there's a lot of traction that could be done with using the bonus authority. I think there could be some improvements to be more farm friendly. It's not that your zoning is necessarily farm unfriendly. It's more that I kind of call it benign neglect. It seems that a lot of rural areas where agriculture still exists, when the zoning was written, it was just agriculture was there and it was allowed. And, and then things like CAFOs and multiple businesses on a single farm property have now are more of the norm than it was. And so it's more that your zoning doesn't address the things that I think are happening in agriculture these days. We have smaller farms, we have more agritourism, we have more farms that have multiple operations. So you might have someone's growing grapes and they have they're making wine and they have a tasting room and they have a restaurant and they have festivals. So by having those things articulated in the zoning, you're being farm friendly because you're offering clarity. And so when we don't have the definitions or some of those other things, it leaves everybody scratching their head. Is it allowed? Is it not allowed? What do we do with it? And so forth. So I think also adding in some things like agricultural buffers. So there's a buffer between non-farm development and farm development is just a good kind of standard practice to promote this mixing of development and farming. Use of the agricultural data statement is actually required. It's required from New York State Ag and Markets Law 25AA. And so your zoning and your subdivision should mention that the ag data statement, if it's for a development that's in or within 500, in an ag district, a New York State ag district, or within 500 feet of an ag district, the applicant has to submit this ag data statement, which is simply listing the farmers and the farmland owners so that they're aware of what's going on. So it has been part of New York State law since the 1970s, but is often overlooked. And I think use of conservation subdivisions also has traction to allow you to have unique mix of residential and agriculture. There's some really great conservation subdivisions that have been built in Pennsylvania that are like themed around agriculture. So the open space that's preserved becomes space for people who live there to grow things, or have barns, horse communities, and so forth. So there's a lot of really creative things that you can do to be more farm friendly and mesh agriculture with all of these other things that you're trying to do. In terms of housing, which I know was a really important topic for everybody, Some of the things that I recommended is allowing 2-family dwellings in all zoning districts, to allow for accessory dwelling units as permitted uses instead of specially permitted uses, or maybe with just some sort of abbreviated site plan, but not the whole special use permit process. I also recommend adding this kind of what we call the missing middle housing, these 3 and 4 unit structures, which are often look like a single family residence, but they have 3 units or 4 units in. And they could be particularly helpful out in the more rural areas of town where we can add in housing opportunities and add in density, but do it in a way that still respects the rural character in the environment. And so I think there's carving out from multifamily homes, specifically 3 and 4 unit structures, and treating them differently. I think that I recommended in there that you develop an abbreviated site plan review for 3 and 4 unit structures to streamline the approval process for them. I think that this next bullet and the last one are kind of go together. Is that I think that your mobile home law is outdated, and that there's a real role for manufactured housing when it comes to affordability. And that I think that we could, first of all, it should be in your zoning law. So at the very least, if you don't do anything, move your mobile home regulations into your zoning law. That gets you to integrate them all together in the same process. But I think that you could have a new manufactured housing policy that talks about the use of all sorts of different kinds of manufactured homes. I mean, even many lovely single family homes now are manufactured homes. And so we need to clarify how you're going to deal with those. And those range from tiny homes to panelized home, modular homes. There really is no such thing anymore as a mobile home. Technically, a mobile home is only a manufactured home built before the HUD regulations. They're all manufactured homes. In New York State has specifically required that you treat a manufactured home just like you treat a stick-built single-family home. So I think that there's some updates that could be done. And I think that when you have like the old kind of, in air quotes, mobile home park, really is more of like a manufactured home community or a cottage community. There's different names for them. But I think that we could take the same process that we use for a conservation subdivision in terms of siting and environmental analysis on the site and clustering, that would be equally good for a clustered manufactured home community as it would for a stick-built community. So that's why I call that require the conservation site designs that go along with, you're not really subdividing, but you're siting them in a way that mimics the same type of thing you would see in a conservation subdivision. So I think this is maybe my last slide, that you had asked me to think about what could the next steps be. And like this, what I have here, really your next steps depends on what you all feel is the greatest need in town, but also what the tolerance for change is. And that's my experience is that some communities do better with a lot of change than others. And so we could, and I don't want to say you could take all these suggestions and make all of the changes all at once and have a new subdivision law and a new zoning law with all of these great things included to get you closer to your conservation or your comprehensive plan. But that is a lot, and it's a lot for people to digest and understand. And I think that I've seen more issues with wholesale, throw out the old and start with the new, rather than a phased approach. And so, you could look at this as we're going to do it all at once, or you could look at it in terms of need. Certainly there's this low-hanging fruit, I called it, that includes things like the purpose statements, the definitions, the process improvements, adding in the conservation subdivision. You already have the groundwork for that. Need to be more detailed about it. Those are, I would consider, low-hanging fruit that could be a potential starting phase for updating your local laws. Working on the design guidelines and moving them into standards, I think there could be some updates to those documents, but that's not, it depends on how far you want to go with them. But then you get down into some of these other things, updating the use table, the dimension requirements. That's where people really start saying, oh, you're going to let me develop less, or you're going to change the requirements, or you're going to change the frontage requirements. This is where people start when we get into density and dimensions. That's where people start like, whoa, what does that mean for me? They get to be a little more difficult in terms of the community coming along with you and understanding the benefits and how it affects them. And I think that, a form-based code for Verna, I would maybe put that back up with the design guidelines. I think because they're related, because the form-based code is largely looking at design and siting. That could be a self-contained thing to accomplish. Your comprehensive plan, though, calls basically for a new zoning map. And I don't disagree with the smart growth perspective of the comprehensive plan, but that's a pretty big change. And it might be something that, rather than scrapping it and throwing it out and starting with a whole new map, is that we try and accomplish what you need to accomplish consistent with the comprehensive plan by not throwing the whole thing out, but reworking and tweaking the districts that you have now, maybe creating a couple new districts, but not like totally tossing it out. So that is like a super quick run through of the report. It's a lot of food for thought, and I have no expectations that everything in there is something you're interested in. But it's things for you to think about. And, I think the really next step is for you all, and I mean the planning board, and then in concert, the town board, what do you really want to tackle? What do you really need to get done sooner rather than later? And what is the tolerance for the level of change? So I'll turn it back over to you, Tony, and you can take it from there.
Great. Thanks, Nan. A lot here.
Yeah. It's a lot to think about.
I mean, I'll start with one question that was sent to me on a chat here, but in the document, you do talk some about enforcement, and you talk about that, there were many comments received about enforcement, and difficulties around enforcement. I guess how much do we need to think about that? And I guess what I'm trying to say is I think we need to really think about that as we rewrite this. We need to make sure that the law incorporates things which allow for enforcement, don't conflict with other codes, which is, I think, part of the problem we're running into right now. And a clear understanding of who enforces what. Does that, I'm trying to read into what you wrote and kind of what we've been experiencing to try to come to like where that is.
Right. No, I think you're right on. I think that from a code perspective, It's both clarity, good definitions, defensible and measurable things. So, the more vague a zoning law is, the harder it is to enforce. So the combination of, like, using your front setback, for instance, where is it measured from? Why does it give you so many problems? Articulating those kinds of things to give the code enforcement officers the tools that they need to actually do their job overall throughout both the subdivision and the zoning. The other part of it is that the process for code enforcement needs to be clearly articulated on who does what. And I think that your code has some, and I don't have it, like, it's because it's on my screen. I don't have it up in front of me at this moment, but I think there was, what is the planning director had some role in the enforcement. There was a mix of kind of building inspector and zoning enforcement officer. And I think that gives a lot of communities problems, in that the zoning authorizes the zoning enforcement officer to enforce the zoning rules. That interacts with the building code, but they really are two separate things. So we have to make sure that the enforcement section of the zoning is written to give the code enforcement officers clarity about what and how they are supposed to do. And it also comes from your process of how an application goes from being approved by the planning board to being, all of your decisions should be submitted to and filed within 5 business days of your making a decision. That's part of the required process. And so how do we get somebody to go from a resolution at the planning board to be able to go into the building department and get a building permit? So it's a combination of the process after the planning board is done with it, and making sure you have the right application forms and the checklists or whatever, tools that we can help to move that along. And the fourth leg, I think that there's a role. So some enforcement aspects need town board and town attorney involvement. And I didn't ask this question, so I don't know, but in other places, I know that the enforcement officers often feel like they're kind of left out to dry, and they don't have support of the judges or the attorneys or the town board. And so I think that enforcement, we can't ignore that the town board has to expect enforcement and make it happen, so that is a part of it. So all of those things have to happen to promote enforcement, in my opinion.
And just one last thing, is it as easy to enforce things like site plan reviews and those? Because some of this is zoning, right? There's the stuff that's in the zoning code, but then you do a site plan review, or you have a conservation subdivision where you have a plat with a building envelope and those kind of things. And what if people don't follow the site plan or don't follow?
Yeah. And that's where, after you're done and the planning board doesn't have any ability to enforce, that's not your role.
Exactly right.
And so that's why, but the one thing the zoning can do is it can create, as part of your approval, an inspection escrow, so that an escrow is collected at the end of the process to cover the inspection capability that you need. And I don't know about your enforcement officers, but in a lot of places, the enforcement officers don't know how to inspect stormwater management facilities. They need to bring someone in who is an expert in stormwater management to say they're doing it right or they're doing it wrong. So the zoning can set up the system so it supports that to happen. But the bottom line is that once that application is approved and it walks out your door, then there has to be built into the system regular inspections with the right expertise so that you know that they're meeting whatever it was that you approved.
Thank you. Other questions? Tell me people have other questions. Must have other questions.
Well, what's that?
This bank of switches.
Nan, we're adjusting the lights.
Oh, okay.
I just want to get more light in, sorry. All right, go ahead, Brad.
Okay, so full disclosure, I've read through 9 out of the 30 pages, so a lot to read through, but thank you, Nan, for a thorough report. And I really like, I have like 18 observations and questions on the first 9 pages, so if I average that out, I'm gonna have 60 by the time I get through this. But, so I don't want to go through them really. I'd rather write these out and submit them in November, Tony, if that's something we can all do. Have a little more time to really go through this, since this is just, it's a lot to digest. So I'll just highlight some of my observations for the moment. They're not really questions. So first of all, I'm really encouraged that you are suggesting, recommending that the manufactured mobile homes be placed into zoning and be more raised awareness and regulation for that. I'm a member of the Tompkins County manufactured mobile home working group. And it's been a really informative and interesting 2 years of study. I'd love to take it on the road for that matter, and introduce it to planning boards throughout the county. But we're making a lot of progress on that, and I think it's absolutely critical that it be recognized as a place where, I mean, there are just tens of thousands of such communities throughout the country, and a lot right here in New York and Tompkins County. So a lot to look at there, and there are communities that could be owned by the residents themselves, or a corporation, or a family. So it's pretty complex. So thanks for bringing that up, because I think we need to really dive into that a lot. So some of the questions I have are about what would you say is examples of real incentives to encourage conservation subdivisions? What are your thoughts on transfer development rights? Given that there's lots of farmland here, and maybe that's the way that connects with density and density bonuses. And it's interesting because, as you know, Nan, the USGBC looks for 7 units per acre to qualify for their neighborhood development LEED certification. So it's just they ended up at that number and that density. So I'm again, I don't want to go through all of my questions, but I'm looking at a lot of the information you put down here and thinking about what it means and how we get there. It's interesting because the residential development, the design guidelines is I don't know if it's a forgotten document, but it's really good. And it shouldn't be gathering dust, it should be used. So great that you're pointing that out too. And it's called for residential, but it could equally apply or expand to commercial.
Right.
Just residential. So it's a great document, and I'm going to revisit that myself, because I think there's a lot of really good information in there. So thanks for bringing that into the mix.
Yeah, well, and you bring up a really good point about transfer of development rights. I don't remember if your comprehensive plan brought that up or not. I'd have to go back and look at that, but I think the on paper, transfer of development rights is like the ideal because it allows landowners who have the land, but it really shouldn't be developed there to get full equity in their land and transfer the density to locations where it should be. So in terms of what your plan has kind of promoted in terms of lower density and then focusing density in your nodes, it makes perfect sense. In practice, transfer of development rights are very complex and hard to work through. They have not been widely accepted in upstate New York, although you do see it downstate and on Long Island, and other parts of the country. The problem with it's a market-driven process. So it's gotta have, and you might have the market, you know, if there's a place, like we did one over in Ballston, which is super fast growing. They've got like housing developments like crazy. I think it's certainly something to look at. I think that they tend to be complex, and I mean, you have an advantage that you have a planning department, you have a planning director, you have staff. Like in a rural community that didn't have that, and it just was your planning board, would be really hard to manage a transfer of development rights program. It's certainly something that you could look at, that would build that equity, for instance, the large landowners, the farm owners who want to get out of farming. They want to sell their land because they don't want to farm anymore, or they need the money. It allows a lot of things to happen. It allows that land to stay open and take advantage of the water and sewer you have in other places. So, you know, I do think it's something that you could look at in recognition that they just, there's a lot of players, because you have to have a buyer, you have to have a receiver, you have to have a land trust, either a land trust involved, or you have to have the town willing to take on all of those development rights. You have to set up the bank, so you have the transfer of money. If you can work all those things out, you know, it's definitely worth looking into, but they are complex.
Thank you. Just two more things out of my bunch, and then I'll pass it on to somebody else here. One was a question, and the other is an observation. So you note on page 6 that there are some terrific conservation subdivisions that have been built around agricultural themes that would fit in great in Dryden. And I'm wondering if you had some specific examples to share with us, not right now, but eventually.
Okay. Yep.
The other was, and here's my one of my concerns, and it's a question, but it's a concern. Under Article 10 documents, you talk about the 4-step conservation analysis, maps, and the 5 questions on page 15 of the design guidelines. And finally, the low impact is development and green infrastructure designs. And I'm just wondering, the concern is, I'm wondering, are we going to be asking a lot of applicants to, for either for subdivisions or other larger projects that are going to require more information, engineering specialists, including your list and some others that I could think of, like traffic and geotech. I mean, we're trying to simplify things, and I'm almost thinking we might be heaping on some more requirements, and I'm not against that. I'm just putting it out there as a kind of question and concern. If we're going to be asking, going to that and asking for those that conservation analysis and the questions and so forth. So that's just something I was thinking about.
Right. Well, I guess the conservation subdivision does take more thought. It's not just a surveyor going out there and drawing in 10 lots or whatever they might get. It does require people to know their land better, and to convey what's on that land, to the planning board better. Is it as simple? You know, I mean, it's very flexible. I mean, the flexibility that comes with a conservation subdivision, I think outweighs those other things, because there's, you know, that the whole idea is to preserve more open space and less infrastructure. So fewer roads, fewer driveways, you know, smaller lot sizes. It fits the bill for a lot of things. You know, I guess it depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to get things through and streamline them and make it as easy for the applicant, none of these things really would fit the bill. I think that the approach that I've had is really a more thorough environmental analysis for good siting. And I don't know, I guess my experience with it, and we could, if we got together in person, I could give each of you a 50-acre parcel and say, here's the 4 steps to do a conservation subdivision. And in 20 minutes, each one of you would have a different and likely acceptable design. So many times communities like that have a natural resource inventory say, you can use the maps from our NRI. We're not looking for you to go out and survey every little vernal pool out there, but we know where a lot of those things are. So I'm not discounting your concern. Yeah, if your goal is to simplify and make it easy for the applicant, then you don't want to add, you know, these kinds of things do add more thought. I'm not saying they necessarily are harder or more expensive, but because right now there are probably subdivisions that right now you can ask for traffic studies and photo simulations and all of those things. And maybe you don't, but I would venture a guess that some of them maybe you should be. If you haven't. So it's there is a balance between not overdoing it and that's why some communities with the conservation subdivision make them voluntary, but heavily incentivize them. So there's a reason for an applicant to go through that. But I guess it, you know, it comes down to policy. What are you trying to accomplish? And you know, I read in your comprehensive plan that you're trying to balance things. You're trying to maintain community character and agriculture, as well as walkable communities and affordable housing. And so there's got to be some give and take to make that happen. It can't be all one side or the other.
Right.
Thank you.
Who else?
Dan
Yeah.
has his hand up.
Yeah,
Oh, Dan does, yeah. Dan.
yeah, and thank you. This, for my money, this is exactly what we wanted. This is so useful, and the way you've explained it is enlightening. And the documents that you prepared, I think, really steer us in a way that at least I wanted to be steered. It seems very user friendly, so I think you've done this really well. I do have a couple things that could use some clarification. Early on, you said when we cite New York state law, we should have an explanatory statement kind of written in. Did I understand that right? So the user better understands the reference to state code.
Well, I'd say more than just an explanatory notice section in there. So take subdivision, for example. The New York state law has very explicit instructions on how a subdivision is done and what the timing is and how the plan, you know, what time frames the planning board can take and where does a public hearing fit in. All
Yeah.
of those are the specific process that I think should be in your zoning law, so everybody knows what the process is.
Even if we're just repeating what is already in state law. So
Even if it's repeating, right? Because otherwise you have to look at the state law and figure that out.
Yeah.
And I just think it makes it clearer for everybody. If it's very rare actually to see, at least from my experience, to see a community that just simply references the state law and says that's how it's done. They almost
Yeah.
all repeat all of that process.
Yeah, that's sort of legalese, and you see
Yeah.
that in other lawmaking. You'll say as referenced in such and such code, but unless you're a lawyer, you don't have that code handy.
Right.
That's a great thing to mention. Now, when you refer to the use of escrow, just in layman's terms, that's a way for the town to get compensated for anything else that we need to invest in terms of research on a project, correct? And the developer would pay that.
Correct.
Just
And so
wanted
the notion is that the taxpayers shouldn't be paying for the review of a private individual's in detail. I mean, more than what the
Yeah.
fee that they pay. So yeah, the escrow is a way that X percentage of the total project or X dollars sit in an account. And if you need to hire a landscape architect to review a landscape plan, they're paid from that escrow. And then at the end of the project, if there's any money left over in that escrow account, it gets given back to the applicant.
Okay, very good. I love the components that you talked about in terms of housing. I think that may be some of the most controversial, but it's probably one of the things that the town board wants to see enacted as soon as possible. So we might be picking that fight right away. But I think a lot of your comments are suggestions are spot on there. About form-based coding, I understand the application in urban settings very well. I get that. How does it play out in rural settings? Can you really pull off form-based coding outside of our hamlets?
I don't think so. To be honest with you, I don't think that it does a very good job in just broad rural. I think you do way better just by setting rural design standards, to say, how the best siting for an individual building is. Form-based code was developed for urban areas, and I don't think that I really don't think they work that well in a rural area, but in your hamlet areas, yes, I think they could.
Okay, I think we're in agreement there. Two last points. I think we're in agreement about special use permits falling on the town board. That's something that board members have talked about for as long as I've been there, and that's about 8 years. We use it, it's triggered too often. So we would be probably 100% comfortable delegating that back. However, is it ever possible for the town to maintain some SUP on a rare occasion? I mean, once we give it away, could we ever and I guess have a trigger so the town could use it on an as needed basis, or is that?
No, that I do know of some instances, like the town of Schoharie, every special use permit is done through the planning board except solar facilities, and that stays that they've kept that authority for themselves. Certainly like the plan unit developments or the plan development type of system is a town board 2-step process. But yeah, I think you could probably carve out some things that you feel the town board especially are the ones that are going to take the lead on that. Although I'm not sure I would cut out the planning board entirely on that. It might be the town board is the decision maker on those instances, but with advice from the planning board.
That's great. And
I mean, and the issue is that if you have the planning board do site plan review and the town board do special use permit, and they're both required for the same project, then that's not very streamlined. So, in general, it's better to keep them together with the planning board. But yeah, I think you could probably carve out some exceptions to that and keep them for the town board.
I think that some that might be more political in nature, that might just break on politics, like solar, might be something that the town board holds on to. Last question. So you mentioned a stream corridor overlay, and we just had a presentation about an aquifer feeding corridor. I guess,
Yep.
How similar would those two things be? So we have a watershed, a portion of our town that feeds into the city of Ithaca's aquifer.
Okay.
Or their water source, their prime drinking water source. And they want us to make sure that area is protected. And that makes sense. And they talked about an overlay added to our zoning. How different would that be from a general stream bank overlay?
So the stream overlay generally regulates things like setbacks from the top of the bank or the amount of vegetation that can be disturbed along the bank. You know, think of it as a buffer. So
Yeah.
like there's 50 feet or 75 feet or whatever it turns out to be that people have to put their building envelope outside that area or minimize the amount of tree cutting, for instance. The aquifer overlay or watershed overlay districts are generally more oriented at uses and the septic systems. So you'll like they'll say like you can't have gas stations, you can't have, you know, highly polluting uses. And it might say, you know, it might limit the density if the soils are such that it could not be suitable for a lot of septic systems. So a lot of watershed overlays address the water quality and through density and through the type of use that it is. So they
Okay.
are different. I mean, they act the same way as that an overlay sits on top of the base. It's added regulations on top of whatever the base is.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much.
John?
Hi, Nan.
Hi.
I have to say, I find myself overwhelmed. In
Sorry.
ways, you know, as I pointed out in my email, I thought your write-up was very instructional. I'd read it and read it again, and each time I read it, some new piece pops out at me. But so I don't think any of us have ever done this before, and it's a struggle. And the notion that we might try and bite it off all at once seems preposterous to me. That we just couldn't do that, and that's why I mentioned in my email to you that I thought a phased approach where we take little bites until at least we get some experience under our belt would be a good way to go. So many technical details occur in my mind that I won't try to bring up. One, the document that you wrote, I like the way you started it. You listed 3 or 4 of the underlying principles that guided you as you look at our documents. Your document will become public, I assume. And I was wondering why you listed subdivisions first. It's a fairly complex topic, and certainly for an experienced reader, it's a scary topic. And we don't do that many subdivisions. I wish we did more, but in the 10 years I've been on the board, if you take out the subdivisions we did for solar, you can count them on one hand. So I guess I'm curious as, you know, did you deliberately put subdivisions first?
No, I didn't deliberately put it first. I can't really answer that there was any reason why I put it first. It's just, I guess in my head, I always kind of consider subdivision and zoning, so I just put it there. You know, they're certainly related, and subdivision has to be consistent with, I mean, they work together. So the subdivision has to be consistent with the zoning. And I think that goes back to that the planning board might not be doing a lot of subdivisions, meaning you're not getting a lot of the major subdivisions that come before you, but there's a lot of minor subdivisions that are approved administratively.
That's true.
So there is a lot, I think there is more subdivision activity going on than what you just said, but like a handful.
Oh, there's no question that there's lots of minor subdivisions that we generally don't hear anything about.
Yeah. And that goes back to like who's the appropriate entity to do minor subdivisions. And, you know, I think that's a policy for the town to figure out. I think there's some issues. I've talked to Ray about it. I think that there's some logistical issues by having a planning administrator do a minor subdivision review and approval. But, you know, if that's the policy of the town, then that's the policy of the town. But no, going back to your original question, we could flip, if you want them before you release this to the public, if you want me to flip them, I'm happy to reorganize that. So zoning comes first, if that would help, or put them in separate documents.
I don't know if we need separate, but it was just a thought that we put zoning first, because when I read zoning, it's not quite as daunting to me. The subdivision piece, the first thing you run into is that we're gonna make it much bigger, which I think some people will find threatening. The mess in Caroline sticks in the back of my mind that we're gonna need to tiptoe as best we can as we wade into this, and bring the public up to speed. To do it in a way that, as often as not, we point out the benefits to everybody of what we're doing. So anyway, just a suggestion that we put zoning first. As I mentioned, I've never done this before, so I've tried to do a whole lot of reading. One document I found that was real helpful for me was an AARP. It was called the Handbook for Improved Neighborhoods, and they had a section called Small Changes Can Make a Big Difference. And their recommendations certainly were to have a very broad and deep public outreach where you try and bring folks along with what you're trying to do. But their recommendation was to do an incremental approach, and they said focus on the most problematic barriers first. And this gets back to something Dan just talked about, your little section on housing. That's where the traction is, I think, for us. That's where we can make the most change on how things are built here in Dryden. And I know you pointed out that that's also one where folks are likely going to get excited about, but it would sure be nice if we could figure out a way to bring that to the community in a way that they understand why we're trying to do it and try and put it in place, along with other things that you mentioned, definition improvements and things like that. I think are important. One other thing I'll mention, you talked a lot this evening about conservation subdivisions. We've actually had developers come and work with us on that, and I think appreciate the flexibility that brings to the process. And I think an easy thing for us to do would be to make that tool available across the board in all the different districts. It'd be an easy thing to do, and I think, as I mentioned, we've had developers come forward where we sit down with them and say, think about the flexibility that conservation can offer you, and to extend that would, I think, be a welcome thing.
Okay.
So, very difficult thing, I think, for us to prioritize all the things that you wrote about and figure out which ones should come first. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, well, I'm sorry you're overwhelmed. I totally get it. It took me a while to sort through it all myself to put it on paper. So I totally get that. And I think that the phased approach from a public point of view is probably easier to do. Why some communities don't do it is because every time you update a local law, the town board is going to have to do seeker and going to have to do public hearing and county planning board review. And it's a process every time you change one of those laws. So some communities choose to do it less frequently, but others, I've done a lot of work in Ankrum, and I think they've done a phased approach, and they, like, every 2 or 3 years, they're ready for their next batch of changes, and they just continually update it as they've gone along. So I can't really help you. I think there's things in that document that you can identify as that low-hanging fruit that would make a difference in terms of process and streamline, and wouldn't be that controversial to take care of some of those things. So I think you could go through and identify low-hanging fruit versus not low-hanging fruit, and start there.
But it sounds like you're thinking that the recommendations that you made in the housing section, which I think are all spot on, that's not low hanging fruit.
Well, and I don't know the town, I guess I don't know your town enough to know that. Like, for instance, in Woodstock, where we spent a long time doing updates to the zoning for housing, just housing. And, something that we thought was started off as simple by allowing for more accessory dwelling units. It like blew up in our face, like, because people didn't want more density. And it just was an unintended and unexpected tail end project where all of a sudden everyone is, like, and they have a different issue they have a lot of short-term rental issues there, where they were thinking they were going to be adding accessory dwelling units for living, and people were afraid they were just creating short-term rentals. So it's not necessarily the same thing, but, allowing for accessory dwelling units, allowing for 2-family houses, even adding the 3 and 4 unit, those might not be that big of a lift, especially the 3 and 4 unit ones. If you put in a design standard that says they have to be designed to emulate a single family home. So it's not like a townhouse, but they're actually just a big single family looking home. And you show pictures of these things to people, that's not that much of a heavy lift. Whenever you change density, that's a heavy lift. People just get really, they're very concerned about either too much density or not enough density. That's a heavier lift to address the density issue. And I don't think your density, you allow for higher density for multifamily. So, I think that you could pick that report apart and pick out some low hanging fruit that you could tackle if the town board was interested in it.
Right, yeah, I'm guessing we'll want to do that. I don't want to move into next steps until folks have had an opportunity to ask questions about your report.
Greg.
Hi, Craig Anderson, yeah. Well, let me start with the ag buffers. They are needed because right now the agriculture is the buffer. There is problems with people building right on the ag with setting their wells in their backyards, and then their well gets contaminated, and the ag has to move. Move. Can't spray within 200 feet. Put manure on the fields for 200 feet. So that is a problem. Stream corridor overlays. Would a CEA work, or critical environmental area work?
So it could be a first step. A critical environmental area does not impose any regulations, though. It's really the seeker process. So it's a place to start. It's a place to say, hey, we're elevating the environmental review of development along our streams. And that gives the planning board it's more of like a red flag, like, hey, we're going to pay more attention to what the impact of this development is on the stream, because it's in a stream corridor. So if you feel a stream overlay where we actually have setbacks from the stream is more regulation than you want to have, I think a CEA is certainly a place that you could start. I'm not sure it would ultimately get you that far, but it is a step towards that understanding of the importance of the stream corridor.
Yeah,
and that's part of our public information, is helping people understand that those are like really important areas.
The one problem, we're so hilly here that when you put a buffer on a stream, you might be 200 feet back off of a bluff, so it's
right. Well, and it might be then not just a standard X number of feet off of every stream. Maybe it needs to be more, targeted to the topography. So it doesn't have to be uniform everywhere. And maybe it just needs to be applied in certain locations.
I wanted it to CEA because that's sort of the better look of the topography of the land and what's there, you know, so, you know, it's something to consider, I think.
Mhm. Yep.
I would be careful when you say you want to reduce lot size. Because we already allow lots built on whatever the Tompkins County Health Department allows, so. And that could be anywhere from an acre to 3 acres, it all depends on what your.
Right,
Are.
right.
And then we also allow. In neighborhood residential, there's a conflict in the zoning law, the definition, I think, says 6 units per acre and the tables say 7. Which is, you know, pretty much the standard. And then in Varna, we allow 7 units per acre, don't we, for residential, so. So, yeah, so I'd be, you know, it's in there already, so we already pretty much matched that. Our big problem is we don't have water and sewer. So we can't get those densities up.
Right. Well, and I think your comprehensive plan promoted water and sewer in focused areas so that you can have water and sewer to have higher density, but not everywhere in town.
Right, and the town, well, now the town board, anywhere around the village of Dryden. Has to be annexed into the village to access their water and sewer. So they made that decision, so we're sort of,
Okay.
they won't even, you know, they've made the decision to do that, which I disagree with, but anyway. The discussion for another day. So again, you gotta be careful with. When you say that, it's not reality in our world here, you know, it's. You know, it gets some people excited, but it's like Brad will be all excited about it, but
Well, in larger subdivisions where you're not relying on individual septic systems, where you have, say, more of a community system, it's not a sewer system, but you have a more of an engineered system. That's where a conservation subdivision or smaller lot sizes could work.
So. When you have an issue with, so you're talking a apartment kind of complex where there are rental units.
Not necessarily, although that could be part of it, but it could be single family homes that were clustered together to be on a community septic, an engineered system for that. So it's
Mainly.
kind of like a self-contained system.
But it's extremely hard to get financing on a community septic system. It's the well is fine. You can get financing for it. So ownership of that house is extremely different. There's only a sort of a niche market for loans for that market. So again, without septic in the cluster, you know, subdivision, you're back to that 1 acre. You gotta have that 1 acre for the well and the septic for the separation. You could reduce it with a community well. But
But we do have some areas that have water other than the village.
we should look into building it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you could get water elsewhere, you're gonna go to a half acre zone, which would be
There's-
great. I mean,
Yellow Barn Road Water District, right?
yeah, and we ran into that with the little subdivision across the street here. Remember, you wanted to do half acre lots.
Yeah.
And-
But part of it, right, because the subdivision as it
Yeah.
sits right now is right on the town line, on the village
Right.
line.
And he wanted half acre lots with water and sewer, and he went
Yeah.
to the county and said no.
Yeah.
And the site plan review and the special use permit, I agree with Dan that there are some uses that are definitely political that need to stay with the town board, like the solar and the so probably the dispensaries, and there's probably a list of them. And I don't know if
Dispensaries
it's,
don't need a special use permit.
pardon me? Dispensaries
Dispensaries
don't.
don't need a special use permit.
But I don't think the planning board should be doing special use permit. I think our job is more just, if it's labeled in the book, it shouldn't be an opinion. You know, so if it's up to us to say, oh, we feel that that's a good idea, it should be more of a defined role for us. Does that make sense? Like the planning board it is our role to just make sure everybody has an equal is treated equally in a review process.
So are you saying that you don't think the planning board should do special use permits?
I don't think they should, no.
And why, I guess I'm wondering, I don't understand. I mean, that's fine, but I'm just trying to understand why you feel that way.
The board, so I think a lot of that is more a political position, if you're gonna allow a manufacturing facility to come in, might be controversial, you know, why are you gonna put it on our laps? That should be the town board to say, you know, hey, you know, that's,
Well, I think that part of maybe we have a little difference in how we interpret a special use permit. So a use that requires a special use permit, if you follow the definition in the state level of what that is, it's an allowed use. It's a permitted use, but it has characteristics that may make it harder to fit into that neighborhood. So it should, I don't look at a special use as something, well, maybe we don't really want it. If you have something labeled as a special use permit, you are saying it's an allowed use, but it just has to go through a special look because it has some aspect of it that's harder to fit in. If you really don't want something in a district, it should be permitted or should be prohibited. So I think like the PDD, the plan unit development or the plan development district, that's something where the town board says, yeah, we want to do that or we don't want to do that. So I don't know, we might just have a different interpretation of what the special use permit means.
well, I have no doubt that most of the uses in that table could be done with just a site plan review.
A lot of them could, for sure.
You could probably narrow down like 10 or 12 that could require a special use permit. So, and that's in my opinion.
Joe?
Yeah, no, thank you. I guess I'm done.
Hey, just wanted to comment on that. So I'm with Nan on this in terms of special use permit. Landing more in the column of our planning board's review. You know, how extensive is it in the table of uses, and the zoning districts is an open question, but the political part doesn't pose me really. It's just a planning review, and it's absolutely common in 95% or more of towns and jurisdictions for the planning boards to be the you know, appointed authority to review, conduct special use reviews, and sometimes that means special use permits, and sometimes that means that there are enforceable there's enforceable language there, and that after, you know, a year or for a year or 5 years, you know, it has to be assured that it's the way it was constructed and what was developed is consistent with what was approved. So I know Craig started to say he agreed with Dan, but it didn't sound like he was agreeing with Dan. But I think it's a good idea to look at that, and if there's one or two uses out there that are somehow political, and that the town board wants to reserve the right to review, you know, I don't see a problem doing that either.
Okay, Joe?
I pretty much now agree with what was just said. Once we trim and make more consistent the uses that are permitted in each of the districts, then this is perfectly within the expertise, the time, the energy of the planning board. And I think that's one reason 95% of the jurisdictions in New York do handle the special use permits versus having the town board do it. The other thing I've thought, sitting for, I don't know, 10 years or so, maybe more, observing the town board, as Nan said to begin with, they have a huge amount of things and a wide variety of issues to deal with. And I've never felt that they had the time and the information that they needed to make consistent decisions on special use permits. I just think it's a perfect thing for a planning board to be doing. I've always wondered what it was in the history of Dryden that caused the town board to delegate this to themselves as opposed to the planning board.
Other questions, Chris?
Man, I saw the accessory dwelling units you recommended. Well, I agree with that. Should we consider anything about short-term rentals, or what are your feelings on that?
Oh, that's a really that's like one of the most complex planning issues that many towns are facing. I think that part of it comes from, again, what policy, the short-term rentals are in some places super important because there's no other lodging, there's no other place for, people to when people come to visit, to stay. It's an economic opportunity for sure. In other places, there's a lot of concern about short-term rentals creating transient neighborhoods and creating problems for long-term residents where, parties and noise and trash and all of those things come up. I think it goes back to the philosophy of the town. Is it an issue? Is it becoming, is there enough short-term rentals in Dryden that you feel that they're taking away rental or other kinds of long-term living opportunities? Are you having noise and trash issues? Are neighbors complaining that, they don't have a stable neighborhood anymore? Those are things that would precipitate communities to want to do some sort of short-term rental. And then there's, you can go from just a registration kind of system all the way to communities who have caps on how many there can be at any given time. There's a whole wide range of things that you could do. So I don't really know enough about how short-term rentals fit in Dryden to say, oh, I think you should do X. But many communities are developing regulations. I think it's not too far off in the future that the state is going to be requiring a registration and a fee so that they're taxed like a hotel, so that I would think that's more of a money thing. They want to, right now, all these short-term rentals are acting like a hotel, but not paying the occupancy tax. I don't know how that is in Tompkins County, whether they've done anything about it at the county level or not. Some counties have. So, again, it all goes back to what's the need that you have to address. Could short-term rentals be a contributing to a housing problem? Sure, in lots of places it is. I don't know enough in Dryden if it is or not.
Did you review our short-term rental law as part of this? Because we do have a short-term rental
Yeah.
law.
Yeah, I don't think I did.
Good.
And do you regulate just by like a registration system, or do you have?
Registration, we don't allow unhosted short-term rentals for more than 30 days or 30 nights a year. It's a short-term rental is only as a use or an accessory use of a person's primary property.
Okay,
And
So maybe
we
you have
require
what-
registration.
Buy a house and turn it into a full-time short-term rental, unless it's I think we do have a provision that if it's adjacent, they can, but like,
Yeah.
I'll have to think about that, but
okay,
But it is somewhat restricted. It does not restrict at all. I mean, there is a registration process, but it doesn't restrict the number of nights that host it. So in other words, if somebody has a wing of a house that they use as a short-term rental, or an accessory dwelling unit that they use as a short-term rental, they can do that as much as they want on their primary property. But it does restrict the unhosted. I mean, the intent was because we were having issues of people buying up houses and turning them into short-term rentals, right?
Right.
Off the market. But we do have a short-term rental law. I think one of the things we probably should look at is how do we incorporate that into the zoning, right? Because should we have a separate law like that, or should it be incorporated into like a use within.
Well, I'm always in favor of incorporating them into zoning. I think there's strength in having them as part of your zoning law from a legal perspective.
It is in Article 9 of our zoning law.
It is, okay.
Article 9 has.
It is the short-term rental.
It's short-term.
Okay, so if it was in the zoning law, then I did read it. I don't recall if I had any, it might have been that I didn't have any issues with how it was written.
I mean, that was relatively recent that we did that, so, it could be that, it was okay, right? Because it was, what we do, it was 3 years ago? Something like that, yeah, done like 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I could look at it again. I don't recall. I mean, there were some things that when I did the review, if I thought they were okay, I didn't comment on it.
That's fun.
Should we make sure to put in the zoning, kind of what you recommended with the state laws, where we kind of spell out if we have a local law or a moratorium or something similar?
Are you referring to incorporating the state procedures in the zoning?
Yes, yeah, just putting like information for a member of the public or somebody that they can just reference it there easier, I guess, or.
Yeah, well, I like to see them spelled out, not just reference. So it's not just state law, town law 261, whatever, or 267. It's everything that you need to know what process you would go through is right there in your zoning law. The process, the timeframes, the requirements, all of that. So you don't miss any steps. And I think that, and no one, this is just the planning board, but I think that's especially important for the ZBA. Because the ZBA has a very different role, and all of the use criteria and the area variance criteria and the process, that's very important for the ZBA. So I think it's super important for the ZBA to have that in the zoning law.
All right. Any other questions, or are we gonna talk about next stuff? Yeah.
How stable is New York State town law in relation to the ZBA and these subdivision and different planning board processes? Because that's the danger in incorporating it into our zoning law, and then if it's changed on a 5-year cycle, you end up having to update our zoning law on a 5-year cycle.
Well, that is true. There's a good example. The state changed. In the mid 1990s, they changed the timeframes from 45 days to 62 days. So you come across a lot of zoning laws that still say, decisions have to be made within 45 days of the close of the public hearing. So yeah, that's true. Yeah, that is true. But again, I was thinking that for clarity, so that everybody knows what the process is going to be without having to go and research and read the state law. I mean, I guess the question, I'll turn it back to you, is when you guys do some sort of review at the planning board level, do you also have a copy of the state regulations there so you know what the requirements are?
No.
All right, so that goes back to, then I think you should have it in your own law. So you have them right there, all in one spot.
I mean, I do always have my computer with me, so I suppose I could look it up.
I just think it's better to articulate them to just simply say, see state law for this section. But that's, again, if it's been working for you, maybe it's not as big a deal as I made it out to be.
Okay. All right.
Well, here, I'll just go.
Go.
Let's go. Just for the record, I find 7 special use permits that I would put in the book. The rest of them could be site plan reviews, just for the record. So, and
Okay. So next steps. And one of the things in thinking about next steps that I'm struggling with a bit is because we also have some things that we need, so when we think about priorities, right, there's the priorities. I think we need to look at this, we need to digest it some more. I know not all of us have had a chance to really digest it as much as we want to. And I think there might be some questions coming back to you.
Okay,
But we also have some other things which are coming up. For example, the town board put a moratorium on crypto mining and data centers, and that's something that's not in our zoning and probably should be incorporated into our zoning. And so, because that has a specific moratorium on it, that's probably going to push up the priority on that. So I guess, I guess any recommendations on how to address that prioritization? It's really up to us, right? Like, we need to think about what's the most important to us, what's easiest to get done soon, right?
right. I mean, clearly if you have a moratorium on something, yeah, that you're kind of obligated to move on. That's why you have a moratorium, is to figure out what you want to do on that. So, that certainly is, I think, the first place that, and I did have a small section in there on crypto mining. But yeah, I think that anything that's got a moratorium on there really needs your attention to draft and get something moving on that. So that would be my first priority, was address the things. If I don't know if you have more than one moratorium or if it's just that. But I would definitely address that within your moratorium timeframe. It's okay to, a lot of communities extend the moratorium, but you got to be working on it. You got to be showing progress that you're doing something about it to keep doing that. But I guess the only advice that I have for you is, as you're going through the report, to identify those items that you think are, like definitions, policy statements, things that are needed to lay the foundation. And I don't want to say you should shy away from controversial things, but I think it's a balance between getting some of the nuts and bolts done, and some housekeeping things done are usually easy and non-controversial. And then identify or star the items that you think are, whether they're controversial or not, like the housing or some aspects of the housing that you think would be, from a policy point of view, you have to address.
Right.
And there's intermediates, like, for instance, I love conservation subdivisions. And maybe you're not ready to mandate them, but maybe you can do a better job of writing the conservation subdivision section and a bonus, a density bonus, so that you're incentivizing them. So that's kind of an intermediate between what you've got and a mandate. So I just think that you have to go through that report and kind of come to a consensus as to what's that low-hanging fruit and what are policy things that need to be addressed to meet the needs in the community. And, the low-hanging fruit, they're low-hanging fruit. The policy things, we shouldn't shy away from controversy just because they're controversial, but you have to, they take more thought and more planning.
Other comments, questions, suggestions? I know John has really been thinking about this next step thing.
Are we ready to move into next step?
Yes.
So, man, it sounded like what you just said was, one ball that is in our court would be to come up with a list of things that we would put into like a phase one.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes sense. That's something that we need to do. And the document that you produced is excellent at explaining what all those things are and what your rationale for writing about them. It's very useful for us. Then talk a little bit about, well, let me preface this. The company that did our comp plan the proposal that they gave us for the zoning update started with a major community outreach. And we all felt that that was probably the second thing. The first thing that we wanted to do was what you did, so that we could understand what we might take to the community is, you know, why are we doing this? And so I think that's where we are now. Can you talk about, you know, so say we've created a list of things that we would like to work on. Talk about the community piece where we then reach out to the community and test the water. How does that work, and what's your role in that?
There's a lot of different kinds of public engagement. And again, it depends on what aspect you're working on. Like, so for instance, design things. Those are easier to address because you can involve the public visually. You can put out, you know, you could do an open house, you can have posters. Do you like this or do you like this? Or if we did this, how do you feel about it? Or rank these different things. So, you know, that's one type of public engagement. The issue that I have seen is that most people don't understand zoning. And it's very hard for them to grasp the you know, a legal concept and what it means. And so I think that sometimes planners make mistakes by saying, well, we're going to work internal until we have what we think is the draft or what we think is the option, and then see what people think, either through workshops or focus groups or open houses and things like that. I just think, like, I'll be really honest, and I think you asked me this, someone asked me this at the interview, is like, what happened in Caroline? Well, what happened in Caroline, they don't have zoning, or they didn't have zoning, and so they didn't know what it meant. But they just, there was so much misinformation about how zoning worked, that it just clouded everything. So I think the public engagement has to be thought out strategically and tied to the different things that you're doing. Like I said, the design, public input on coming up with design standards or a form-based code is different than if you're going to change zoning districts. And there are planning firms that are in business to do public engagement for planning processes. And that might be for zoning something that I would think about. I mean, I do public engagement all the time, but I don't concentrate just on public engagement, where there are people who that's what they do, is public engagement campaigns. You know, it's hard for me to say, like, do I think you're ready for public engagement now? No, I don't think you have enough direction to get public input on. People need to react to, are they going to read a 30-page report like I gave you? I don't think so.
And are they going to understand it?
Yeah, so I think your job right now is to identify what you need to do. Are you going to concentrate on the low-hanging fruit? Then you can explain to the public, we're updating our purpose statements, we're updating definitions, and we're doing X, Y, and Z. Those are something that you can explain to them. If you want to do the housing, for instance, then it's a different kind of public engagement. And you say, here's the 5 options for enhancing housing in Dryden. And then you design a public engagement process to get feedback on those 5 options, for instance, you know, like making ADUs a permitted use or adding 3 or 4 unit structures. So I think the public engagement, I think you have to do some foundation work first to know how you're going to slice and dice this, and then design the public engagement around that. Like, for instance, the housing is not just the public, but maybe you want to involve some of the developers in the area and get their feedback on it. So that's, there's all sorts of different things. Sometimes it's one-on-one, sometimes it's a mailing to, affected landowners. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. And in terms of my enrollment and my involvement, based on, to be honest with you, after we're done with this report, I don't have any involvement with you. Unless you want to move and have a new contract for something. My work with you was to do this report and help you understand it. And I'll work with you until you've done that. But you had separated this into 2 phases. So that's the second phase. So that's a different conversation, to be honest with you.
Oh, absolutely. I agree 100% that we're moving into a next piece, and we either need to amend your existing agreement or create a new one.
Craig, did you have something?
Yeah, so I look at this like what Nan's saying too. First steps, stream court, if we're going to be serious about stream corridors, we should talk to the conservation board, see if that's something they want to tackle.
Right.
Same with buffers for agriculture, ag board, give it to them, get their input on it.
I mean, you could do the same thing for housing. I mean, that's another approach. You could give the report to those committees. I talked to them all and say, here's the report, and we'd like you to come back in 3 months or 6 months or whatever with 4 or 5 options to address your topic. And then you coordinate it.
Exactly. The more support you get,
Right.
It's just not our view. It's
Right.
views.
Right.
And if we're looking for something to do, we can start weaving the design guidelines into the subdivision and zoning law.
But we also need to tackle the one that has the moratorium on it too.
Well, I'm saying, but this can all be done
Yeah.
together, but this is all gonna come to one conclusion.
But I
in a
think
year.
it's good to do the definitions and design requirements kind of.
And
first, because-
update the
yeah.
definitions and add to them if you had to. So I think all those, before you even talk to the public or something.
too. I think
Yeah.
procedural.
Yeah,
The
because,
procedural stuff, right,
Yeah,
that could be
yeah.
before we talk to the public too. right?
so yeah, all that should be done. But I'm trying to get the boards involved, just because,
Right.
to get their input, and it would also take some of the load off of us.
I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. I think when I talked to those group, they were all super interested and super invested in this. And I think that's a really good idea.
You're done? Greg's done, okay. Anything else? Before that, Nan, really, thank you. This really was very good. This was great.
Thank you.
I mean, reading it's one thing, but then actually sort of talking through it, I think really kind of solidifies a lot of stuff, right? So it's we got a lot of work to do.
Yeah, well, and if you want another session, like after you've had more time to digest it and think about some of these concepts, if you want, some other session to, say, gee, tell me more about how a conservation subdivision works. Or, show me a form-based code or whatever it might be, we can do that too. And if you wanted to do that, you could probably even consider that part of your required 4-hour training. If we did it like, gee, what do these techniques really mean?
Yeah, hey, there's a good idea. I like that idea.
We get an hour for this.
I would say, yeah. I mean, you're learning about different methods. I would say absolutely. Why not? Have you learned something? Then it's a training.
Yeah, I'd say we have learned something.
Yes.
So Nan, another question, and this one's about schedule. So we mentioned the moratorium that we have on the data centers and crypto. If we came back with a list that included the low hanging fruit, the update of the definitions and the inclusion of the statements on, why are we doing this, and that bring the comp plan into the zoning. So the sort of the nuts and bolts boilerplate piece, and then a couple additional ones like housing, for example, that we wanted to bring in, plus the data centers, and we've also got a battery storage issue. What's your thought about when, and well, for starters, would you be the person who would be drafting the language? And if we wanted to bring the design guidelines in, would you be the one who would be doing the drafting and incorporation of that? Is that something that you do, or do you farm that out?
No, I do that. I do have a partner though that's that he's a planner but has an architect background, and he and I have worked together. I could send you the design standards that we did, or you can look it up on the Village of Voorheesville. He does the kind of the illustrated and the design side of the zoning. So I do a lot of drafting. I'm certainly comfortable with that, provided that I know what you want to accomplish. I don't want to make the policy. I need to implement the policy. So you would have to be clear about what your policy is. So, and I have a land use attorney that is on, I don't employ him, but he's on my team. He's like amazing. I can bring in engineers. So yeah, it wouldn't be just me, but I can coordinate involving others that would need to bring in that kind of expertise. Or, you had an RFP, you could do I'm not saying I want to give away the work, but you can do another RFP and see what you get from other firms out there.
My sense is that we would not do that, I think we're pretty happy with the work that you do, and we've invested a lot of time in it. Suppose 3 months from now, we've reached out to our internal boards, as we were just talking about, and they've come back with recommendations on the individual areas. We put all this stuff together. And then we begin the public outreach piece and, processing that. And in your experience, how long does it take before you're finally ready to codify some new zoning? Is that a year or 2 years?
Well, I would say if we concentrate on, let's just say we concentrate on low hanging fruit, the purpose statements, the definitions, the writing part is not the hard part. It's line by line at the planning board, going through it, editing it and tweaking it to make sure it's your voice and not my voice. There's often a lot of meetings and a lot of back and forth. Like, we'd like it to say this, or we want it to say this, and how, I need to do some thinking and research on that. And then I guess before I answer the question is the town board, how does the town board feel about all of this? So sometimes what happens is the planning board, we do all of this work and it takes 8 months of back and forth, and we finally have a document, and then you go through with the town board, because they're the ones who have to adopt it, and they go line by line, and you spend another 8 months going line by line with the town board. That is something to think about in your time frame. So I guess I throw it back to you, and that the timing of it is partly what the town board, how they're going to work on it. I mean, most town boards don't just take what the planning board has done and say, yep, sounds good, let's adopt it. They often go through these with a fine-tooth comb because they have a different perspective. But I would say that, we would need, with public engagement, it's probably at least 8 months.
Oh, okay.
That quick.
So if every,
But I think it's been a lot more. I mean, I've worked, like the housing piece in Woodstock was about 18 months. That was a whole nother story that I can get into another time. But yeah, that was just housing, but they had all sorts of controversy at the end because people didn't want to increase density.
and I think you said the tower, right?
Say that again?
you threw in the towel at Woodstock.
I didn't really throw in the towel. The town board threw in the towel. They gave up on it because there was too much controversy.
Yeah. I think there's an important lesson there.
After spending 18 months on it, wow.
Right.
Yeah, it was a lot of volunteer. I mean, we met every other week for 18 months.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, okay. Well, that's real helpful. And then I also remember when we started working with you, obviously you're busy. And how are you set for fitness in?
Well, after I have an incredible number of projects that are coming due and I'd like to be finished in December and January, the early part of the year. After that, it gets much better.
Uh-huh. Contractually, this is all pretty loose right now. It would be impossible for us to ask you for a fixed price proposal to move ahead. Do we normally get a not to exceed from you and move forward in that sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the not to exceed is generally the way it happens, although in order to do that, we would want to know what you were expecting to get. So, you know, it's not just like we want the whole zoning redone, but like we're going to tackle this, this, and this. And we would look at what kind of public engagement we would need, what kind of expertise we would need. And so, yeah, it's generally a not to exceed fee.
So we need to really do our part.
Yeah, so yeah, how does this sound? So it sounds like, as we said, the ball's in our court, that we need to spread the work out to our boards and stuff like that. And if we can come back in 2 or 3 months with a framework for how we want to move ahead, some definition of scope and stuff like that. Between now and then, should we amend your contract to allow us to engage you with questions and stuff like that? Should we just?
Well, I think in terms of questions about the report and the techniques that I've talked about, and I'd have to confirm with Ray, I think there's money left in the budget.
So you guys will, so, yeah. Uh-huh, yeah. So I'm sure between now and this time where we come forward with a scope, that will need some of your help. And then at that point, we can talk about the not to exceed.
Yeah. I mean, for me and for you, I would want to have that scope of work before we agreed on anything. But I have a contract with you now. I forget what it was. I'd have to look up to see what I've already spent, but I'm happy to continue working with you in relation to things in the report and helping you sort through that, up to, I think it was 15,000 for this phase. I'd have to look it up, but I think that's what it was.
Gotcha. Okay.
Dan, any thoughts on any of this?
Well, I think the comp plan that we've done set out a lot of, signals that we were going to do something to our zoning. So politically, I don't think there's a big surprise that we're going to be updating our zoning in a number of, significant ways. And the town board supports these changes. So I feel like we would be able to communicate why we're doing this and not micromanage the work that the planning board would do to do these updates that, we just discussed, the 5 or so things that John just went over. I think those are things that, we'd want to get in and probably as soon as we can. And yes, as far as continuing the work with Nan, the town would support that.
Dan, are you adding anything into the tax bill as a letter this year? Because this might be a good opportunity to tell people that we're updating the zoning. Sometimes maybe we'll slip something in the tax bill, a flyer.
I don't know if we know we're going to be updating the zoning at a particular time. Depends on the work of this group, if it's ready. So I can't, I would be reluctant to say, since we don't have a proposal in hand, to say in the tax bill that we're going to update our zoning. I would be very forceful and I think the town would be in making sure residents knew if we did do this, but I don't think it's ripe enough or mature enough to put into the tax bill at this point.
When's the next election year for?
Well, we rotate, so you know the supervisor's up in the fall, I'm up in the fall, and I think Leo, one other member.
And then, okay. And then is it 2
Two-
years
2
after
years.
that is the next one, or is it
Mhm.
every year?
Yeah, it's every 2 years. But you know, I think we have the political capital to put into something like this. It's a big lift. But you know, we generally have something big on the agenda every time there's an election cycle, and the work that we're doing has earned us a certain amount of trust. So I don't think we'd be in a situation like you just described in Woodstock, where the town board, you know, got cold feet. There will be some resistance, but just like the STR law that we passed, that was fairly aggressive. I mean, we were doing that before a lot of communities were doing short-term rental regulations, and we got limited blowback. I expected more, but we went ahead and did it, and I'm glad we did.
Yeah, what's interesting is we didn't get a lot saying we weren't lax enough, but we did get a couple comments about they wanted it stronger.
Oh, right.
There were a couple people that wanted us to like ban short-term rentals altogether.
Well, until they're allowed, until they're written in, they are banned, right? I mean, unless we provide for them, they're an unauthorized use.
Yeah. And then the enforcement issue becomes one, something, but that's, yeah. Okay.
I mean, and you know, and just real quick, the issue about cryptocurrency and data mining, I mean, it could be simple if you decide. So first of all, you have to decide if you want it or you don't want it. If you don't want it, that's simple. You just change your use table. You write and clarify that it's not on the use table and it's not allowed. If you want it, then that's where you have to identify where it's allowed, how much is allowed, and what the development standards for it are. So it could be something really simple if you decide you don't want it. I don't know.
Setbacks, noise regulations, all that kind of stuff. Because the biggest issue with crypto mining is and high-end data centers is AI data centers, same thing, is noise from cooling,
Yep.
power usage, right?
Power usage. And Nan, and this might be a little off topic, but if we were to regulate crypto, and one of the big concerns that we have is the amount of energy it uses, can you regulate like how much energy an industry can use? Put a cap in your zoning?
Well, that would be a special use permit. That's what a special use permit does, is it regulates the use itself.
Mhm.
So that's where the special use permit comes into being. I don't know, I'd have to, I mean, I guess legally, could you do that? I mean, it's no different than saying you can't have a building bigger than 50,000 square feet. Communities do that all the time.
How would you enforce it though?
What?
How would you enforce it?
Well, you know, and the thing is with energy, you know, they could say, well, you know, you could say, well, we don't have any more than, you know, X amount of capacity. And they'd say, well, we're just going to invest in a new substation and build the capacity. So yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit.
Or as this guy, if I understand this particular proposal, and I might not, he's claiming all kinds of technology that will mitigate virtually all of the bad things that we think we associate with traditional crypto mining. I'm less clear on how he says, or if he actually does say he's going to mitigate energy use. I think maybe he just says it's a small deal, but Tony, you may know more.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the one that's proposed is not a very big one, and so the energy usage as crypto mining goes is not all that great, but for a facility the size of it is going to use a lot of power for you know, if you look at like lot size or building size to power usage, it's going to use quite a bit. But Yeah, and most of the stuff he's talked about is mitigating the noise and that stuff, not the energy usage. He's not gonna be able to mitigate the energy usage. Because whatever energy it uses.
If I could, I did put the question directly to the developer and his response is worth mentioning. He just said, that's none of your business, how much energy this thing uses. That's not your problem. And I said, it is our problem if we're being told we can't bring in multifamily housing, and that's a top priority for the town because there isn't enough energy supply. And we have heard such comments from NYSEG about development. And so I bring this up because doing that type of work can limit the other type of development we can do if the power is just not there on the grid.
We could do, so for example, maybe the grid in the area can handle that right now, but then say a multi-unit development came up just down the road, it may have to push onto that developer any upgrades to the power grid system in order to handle the power that's needed. And I don't like that at all, right? Because this, I would rather see us, let the capacity be used by housing development rather than and if somebody's gonna pay for those upgrades, I would rather have it be the crypto mining operation or the heavy power usage operation, industrial use, whatever it is, than say the housing development down the road, right?
Well,
So we write that
as
into the
Nan just
SCP,
said,
right?
the simplest thing might be to say no.
It might be.
Well, that's what I said, is that, that's the easy thing to write if you're gonna just say no. It's more involved to write the standards that go along with it if you're gonna say yes.
And
And that may be a reason not to do it, because the standards would be so complex and beyond our capacity.
And the main thing we need to be really careful of is we can't write this based on a project, right? It has to be based on a usage so I think when we're talking about this stuff, I think we need to think about the general usage overall. That's really what we're talking about. And it's not a particular project or developer that's proposing something, but no, I think there's a lot of things to talk about, and I can see where it's, there's a number of these things that could be built. And like I said, AI hosting facilities fall into the same realm as crypto mining. And so we need to think about those things. But yet, say an insurance company down the road wants to put a big data center in their building. Well, that's, for their business use, that's sort of a secondary use of that property. And then, so how does that fit in, right? But anyway.
Yeah, and the only advice I can give you, because those are all policy decisions, but you should be looking at your comprehensive plan and seeing how that use fits into what the broad policies you've already adopted in the plan are.
Right. Exactly right. Okay. Anything else? We are approaching, we're after 8:30, sorry.
Yeah,
Wasn't paying attention to the time.
been a couple hours.
So yeah, we had planned on this for 2 hours. We're over 2 hours. Anything anybody else has? Nope.
Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thanks, Ned.
All right, take care. We'll talk to you soon.
Good holiday.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.